Tim. Where do I start? Experiments are wonderful, and they're the only way where we can learn something for real. For example, think about medicine. Thousands of years ago, we started accumulating medical evidence, but mostly it was placebos. We didn't know really anything for sure, and we kept on doing these awful treatments. Along came the FDA, and while we have all kinds of complaints about the FDA, they force us to do experiments. And with those requirements to do experiments, we actually learn much more. Now, drug tests are clearly limited, and from your perspective, you can think of them as lab studies. The people who are participating in the experiments know that they are participating. They are particularly monitored, and they know that they are particularly monitored. They take medications under very strict conditions. These are people that have no other illness aside from the one that they are being tested for. The medications have no brand labels, and they don't pay for them by themselves. So all of those could mean that this is a lab experiment that should not be generalized for the real world. But of course, even you, my rational friend, would not believe that this is the case. Now, it's true that actually we can improve on medical testing. For example, we did an experiment recently in which we brought people to the lab and we measured their pain tolerance. We connected them to a machine that gave them electrical shocks, and we measured how much pain they could take. After that, we gave them a painkiller we called Varadon RX, and we asked them to sit 15 minutes next to old Newsweek and Time magazines to make them feel like they're in a real doctor's office. And then we measured their pain tolerance and perception again. First, the Varadon RX was only a placebo, but more importantly, it was either described to them as being expensive or being cheap. And it turns out that the cheap medication worked much worse than the expensive medication. In some sense, our expectations about payment translate into our expectations about efficacy and changes the efficacy of the medication. Now, from my perspective, this is not just about price. It's also about generic versus brand and about other market variables. And it means that perhaps we could get a better experiment if the FDA would include those factors in these testings. But it doesn't mean that the regular testing is not useful, that we don't learn enough from it. Psychological experiments are very much in this vein. What we learn from their experiments are factors, are influences, are little players that influence how we behave. Now, how much each of those players or factors would influence our real world, our behavior in the real world, we don't know. So what we do is we identify the parameters, and then we come to a particular situation, we test it specifically. So we can check, for example, how much internal motivation influences people in their activity, and then when we go back to implement some teachers' plan for incentives like the No Child Left Behind, we might want to test it specifically how it works. No experimentalist will ever tell you that what we learn in the lab translates one-to-one to the real world, but we do believe that these are the essence, and the different things will be combined in different ways in the world, and that's what we need to study. Now, my friend, many times rational economists like yourself say, well, you do things in the lab, it's small scale, there's not a lot of money involved. Once you make it for real, once you make it with a big amount of money, then you will see that people behave more rationally. Are you okay there, by the way? Just I want to make sure you're comfortable. Okay. So, in some cases, I'm sure that the stakes in the lab and the particular framing would make something translate differently in the real world. But will that necessarily always mean that in the real world people will be more rational rather than less rational? So I'll give you an example. As we talked in the last blog, we have these issues with payments and how much we pay executives. So we did this study in which we paid people a lot of money. Now, when you pay people a lot of money, they should behave more rationally, right? But in fact, they behave less rationally. For me, this suggests that sometimes when we move things from the lab to the real world, the result could generalize just as easily. Sometimes it might be weaker, but sometimes, like in our experiment in India, when real money is involved, the difficulty of performing well could actually increase and performance could actually deteriorate. Now, let me say one last comment and then give you, my friend, some homework. I want to relate to the experiment you described by John List. John List did this very elegant experiment in which when people were given an unexpected pay raise, they were altruistic for a while, they produced more effort, but 90 minutes later, this effect went away and people became selfish again. Now, you, my friend, decided to interpret this as people becoming rational. But what does it mean that people are irrational for the first 90 minutes and then they become rational? Like, they totally forgot everything they learned in Economic 101 and all of a sudden 90 minutes later they say, oh yeah, of course I need to be rational here, so therefore let me go and behave this way. I don't understand the logic of this. If people are irrational, at some point, what does it mean about rationality? Shouldn't rationality mean that people do it all the time as a first instinct, as a first response, without any problems? Now, if you ask me, I could interpret the results of shifting after 90 minutes in all kinds of ways. For example, maybe people forgot about it. Maybe they conveniently forgot about the incentives. Maybe they thought it was time, they repaid it, and now it's time to move on to behave differently. Why do you decide that this is rational rather than some other irrational factor? After all, if people are irrational in the first 90 minutes, why would they switch to being rational? And now for your homework, what I would like you to think about is what kind of experiment, what kind of setup, what kind of conditions would convince you that people are not rational? Well, Tim, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate it. I can't remember the last time I enjoyed a discussion with a rational economist as much as I did with you this time. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thank you. Thank you.